Kristen Williams, put the satchel down and step over here.
Oh, is this about the root keys? Because I already checked them out.
This is about the arrow key sold outside the station.
Once is a mistake. Twice is suspicious. Kristen Ariel Williams sold her federal master key not once, but at least twice, and the text messages on her phone prove she knew exactly what she was doing every single time.
The what? Wait, no, I thought you were asking about my route.
The Bel Air Mall collection box is open with that key.
Oh, hold on. You're saying I sold what? That doesn't even make sense.
She would not get the chance to walk away from this one. Within 72 hours, federal postal inspectors would seize her phone, pull her PNC bank statements, and reconstruct an entire conspiracy from a single thread. A stolen government key worth $2,500, hundreds of pieces of mail, $48,000 in fraudulent deposits, 30 months in federal prison. What started as one quiet transaction inside the Pritchard, Alabama post office would expose the most dangerous vulnerability inside the entire United States Postal Service architecture. And the text messages on her phone would do most of the talking. The number you just heard, $2,500, sit with that for a second. That is what an active federal mail carrier sold the master key to her entire delivery area for. Type that number in the comments if it shocked you. Subscribe if this is your first time here. The full story is worse. Kristen Ariel Williams was born in Mobile, Alabama in 1991. She grew up in Pritchard, the working-class city of roughly 22,000 people that sits just north of Mobile on the western shore of Mobile Bay. Pritchard had been losing residents for 40 years by the time she was born. Her mother worked as a certified nursing assistant at a long-term care facility off Highway 45. Her father worked construction off and on, mostly off. The household ran on her mother's paychecks and on whatever cash her father brought home in good weeks. She was the oldest of three. She walked her younger brother and sister to school every morning, past the same row of mailboxes on Whistler Street. The mail truck came at the same time every day. The driver waved. To a kid in Pritchard, a federal job was something you grew up watching from the porch. She graduated from Vigor High School in 2009. Her transcript was unremarkable. A counselor noted she was punctual, polite, and consistent. She tried one semester at Bishop State Community College, taking general education credits, and dropped out when the financial aid did not cover books. She moved into a one-bedroom apartment off Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Avenue and took a job at the McDonald's on Telegraph Road for $7.25 an hour. She stayed there for 3 years. By the time she left, she was a shift manager making $9.50 an hour and supervising 6 other crew members on the closing shift. Her last performance review described her as reliable, even-keeled, and capable of handling difficult customers without escalation. In 2012, she applied to the United States Postal Service. She passed the assessment exam on her first attempt and was hired as a city carrier assistant at the Mobile, Maine Post Office on St. Joseph Street. The starting hourly rate was $16.73. She came home from her swearing-in ceremony with a federal lanyard, a route binder, and a pair of black leather work boots she had bought on layaway. For the first 18 months, she worked split routes, covering for carriers on vacation or sick leave. She delivered mail in Crichton, in Toulminville, in the long, flat residential blocks west of Stanton Road. She learned the routes the way carriers always learn them, by foot and by repetition, by the specific bend in a sidewalk and the specific dog behind a specific fence. She memorized which porches had bad steps and which screen doors stuck. In 2014, she was promoted to regular city carrier and transferred to the Pritchard Post Office on Wilson Avenue. She was 23 years old. Her starting salary as a regular carrier was $43,400 a year, with full federal benefits and the federal retirement system attached to every paycheck. Her supervisor's first-year evaluation described her as detail-oriented, particularly with vacation hold orders and forwarding requests, and showing strong aptitude for the operational side of route management. She bought a 2008 Chevy Impala from a buy here, pay here lot off Highway 45. She moved into a 2-bedroom rental on Wolf Ridge Road. She began sending money home to her mother every month, $200 on the first and another $100 at the middle, never missed. By 2018, she had been promoted to a regular route that ran through the residential blocks east of Bel Air Mall, one of the steadiest, most predictable routes in the Pritchard rotation. Her annual performance reviews use the same language year after year: punctual, reliable, trusted. In her 9th year on the route, she would be photographed for the Carrier Honor Board on the wall of the Pritchard post office. 6 months later, she would steal the key that opened every collection box in her area. That was the path. It was not glamorous. It was not fast. It was the kind of slow federal career that builds quietly across a decade until it becomes a person's entire identity. It would unravel in the time it took to deposit a single counterfeit check. To understand what Kristen Williams sold for $2,500, you have to understand the architecture of the United States Postal Service collection box system. The blue boxes are everywhere. Every American has walked past one. The Postal Service operates approximately 140,000 of them across the country. They sit on street corners outside grocery stores, in front of strip malls, in apartment complex lobbies. They are open to the public on the deposit side. Anyone can drop an envelope inside. The retrieval side, the side carriers use to pull mail out, is secured by a single category of lock. That lock is opened by what the Postal Service calls an arrow key. The arrow key is not a key in the way a homeowner thinks of a key. It is a piece of federal property assigned to mail carriers for routine operational access. A single arrow key opens every blue collection box inside a defined geographic area. It opens the cluster mailbox banks at apartment complexes. It opens the parcel lockers in cluster box units. It opens the back panel of most apartment building mailrooms. In operational terms, an arrow key is a master key to every piece of physical mail moving through an entire neighborhood. The Pritchard Post Office served a coverage area of roughly 12 square miles. The Bel Air Mall area route alone included 31 blue collection boxes, 4 apartment complex mailbox banks, and the cluster boxes for 2 residential subdivisions. On any given day, those boxes held thousands of pieces of mail: personal checks, tax documents, birthday cards with cash inside, insurance correspondence, court notices, credit card applications already approved, business invoices, account statements bound for ordinary households. A single arrow key in the wrong hands compromises all of it. The Postal Service knows this. Arrow keys are signed out at the beginning of each shift and signed back in at the end. Each post office maintains a log. Supervisors are supposed to verify the count at the end of every business day. Lost keys are supposed to be reported within hours, and any time a key cannot be accounted for, the entire affected area is supposed to undergo a rekey, an expensive process in which every lock in every collection box and mailbox bank is replaced. A rekey for a coverage area the size of Pritchard's runs the Postal Service tens of thousands of dollars and pulls carriers off their routes for days. In practice, the system runs on trust. The supervisor who signs the key out trusts the carrier who signs for it. The carrier trusts that the lock at the end of the route will open the same way it did yesterday. The customer who drops an envelope into the blue box trusts that the only person opening that box is a federal employee acting within the scope of duty. The architecture is held together by the integrity of one credential and the assumption that the person holding it will not sell it. In late 2022, the Pritchard Post Office was already tightening its arrow key protocols. According to internal Postal Service records that would later be cited at trial, the office had begun more aggressive shift-by-shift verification because of regional concerns about key security. Carriers were being reminded that arrow keys were federal property. Signed acknowledgments were being collected. The word that came up over and over in the internal memos was strict. Kristen Williams signed those acknowledgments. She knew the protocols. She knew what an arrow key opened and what it was worth on the secondary market. She sold one anyway. The relationship between Kristen Williams and Antonio White did not begin with the arrow key. It began with a counterfeit check. In June of 2022, 4 months before the October arrow key transaction that would anchor the federal indictment, White approached Williams with what investigators would later describe as a test run. He needed a bank account. Specifically, he needed a bank account at PNC with a clean transaction history, held by a person with a steady federal paycheck whose deposit patterns would not flag the bank's automated fraud detection. Williams's account fit the profile. On June 21, 2022, a counterfeit check in the amount of $4,000 was deposited into Williams's PNC bank account. The check was drawn on the account of Akbar Talebi, a small business owner from Theodore, Alabama, a community about 20 miles south of Mobile. Talebi's original check had been stolen from the mail. The signature on the duplicate was forged. The check itself was a clean reproduction generated from the routing and account numbers visible on the genuine document. The deposit cleared the initial hold. Williams withdrew her share within 48 hours. White received his. That was the first transaction the two of them ran together. It would not be the last. Through the summer and into the fall of 2022, the relationship between Williams and White settled into a pattern that the federal indictment would later describe as a conspiracy to commit bank fraud. The mechanism was simple. White obtained checks. Williams provided the bank account. They split the proceeds. The money was small enough per transaction not to attract attention, but consistent enough to add up. What White did not have was a reliable source of stolen mail. That was where the arrow key came in. By late October 2022, Williams had been working at the Pritchard post office for over 8 years. She had access to the arrow key cabinet. She knew the sign-out procedures. She knew which keys covered which areas, and she knew the keys that covered the high-volume Bel Air Mall collection boxes were among the most operationally valuable in the building. On a date, investigators were never able to pin down precisely, but which fell within the last 10 days of October 2022, Williams took an arrow key from the Pritchard post office that she had no authorization to remove. She did not report it lost. She did not report it stolen. She walked it out of the building at the end of her shift and carried it home. She sold it to Antonio White for $2,500 in cash. What White did with the key turned the small counterfeit check operation into something much larger. Over the first 3 weeks of November 2022, White used the stolen arrow key to open collection boxes outside the Bel Air Mall on Airport Boulevard in Mobile. Bel Air Mall is the largest indoor shopping center in southwest Alabama. The collection boxes outside the mall received heavy public use, including business mail from the surrounding retail complex, personal mail from the residential neighborhoods adjacent to it, and outgoing payments dropped after business hours by customers who did not trust the inside mail slots at their own banks. White did not steal randomly. He worked the boxes systematically, late at night, and in the early morning hours when the parking lot was empty and the carriers had not yet begun their routes. He pulled mail by the handful, hundreds of pieces of mail across November alone. He took it back to wherever he was processing it and sorted it for checks. The checks were the prize. With each check, he had everything he needed to manufacture a counterfeit. The victim's name, the victim's address, the victim's bank, the victim's account number and routing number, both printed in clean MICR encoding at the bottom of the check. A specimen signature visible on the face. Within 48 hours of pulling a check from a Bel Air Mall collection box, White could have a counterfeit version of that check in his hand, ready to deposit. Williams's PNC account was not the only deposit channel he used during November 2022. Investigators would later identify additional accounts at additional banks held by additional people, an entire small infrastructure of cooperating depositors. But Williams was the one with the federal job. She was the one who supplied the key. She was the architecture. The signs that something was wrong inside the Pritchard post office were available, if anyone had been positioned to see them. The arrow key inventory should have come up short at the end of one specific shift in late October. According to subsequent investigative review, the loss was either not detected at that moment or not escalated when it should have been. The cabinet was checked. The count was signed off. Life went on. Williams continued to work her route. She continued to receive favorable performance reviews. She continued to draw her federal paycheck and her federal benefits. She sat in the break room with the same colleagues she had sat with for 8 years. None of them knew. She had stolen a master key to every mailbox in their delivery area, and none of them knew. The catalyst was not subtle. It was not a routine audit. It was not a whistleblower. It was Antonio White himself, caught on camera with the stolen key in his hand. On a night in mid-November 2022, mobile police department patrol officers were running a routine sweep of the Bel Air Mall parking lot in response to a separate string of vehicle burglaries that had been reported in the area. The mall closed at 9 o'clock. The lot emptied out by 10. The collection boxes sat in a row along the access drive that ran behind the southeast corner of the property. At approximately 1:15 in the morning, the officers observed a man standing at one of the collection boxes. He was not dressed in a Postal Service uniform. He was not driving a Postal Service vehicle. He had what appeared to be a key in the box's retrieval lock, and he was pulling handfuls of envelopes out of the box and stuffing them into a black canvas bag. The officers approached. White did not run. He told them, initially, that he worked for the Postal Service and was making an after-hours collection. He did not produce a postal employee identification card because he did not have one. He did not produce a vehicle marked with USPS livery because there was no such vehicle in the lot. What he did produce, eventually, when the officers patted him down, was the arrow key. He had it on a small split ring in his front pocket. The officers detained him. The mail bag was secured as evidence. A federal call went out to the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, the law enforcement arm of the Postal Service. By sunrise, an inspector was at the mobile police department's central precinct, examining the contents of the bag. There were hundreds of pieces of mail. The mail had not been opened. It was still in its original envelopes, addressed to homes and businesses up and down the mobile area, much of it to addresses on or near the Bel Air Mall corridor. The Postal Service inspector cataloged the contents over the next several hours. Personal correspondence, greeting cards, insurance documents, tax forms, approximately 40 checks written by ordinary people, drawn on a dozen different banks, intended for ordinary purposes. That mail was federal evidence the moment the officers seized the bag. But the arrow key in White's pocket was the thread that would lead to Williams. Arrow keys are stamped with identifying marks tying them to a specific office and a specific area. The inspector pulled the markings, ran them against the Postal Service's internal records, and identified the key as one that should have been signed out and signed back in at the Pritchard Post Office on Wilson Avenue. The next question was who had signed it out last. The Pritchard sign-out log produced a name. The name was Kristen Williams. She did not know any of this on the morning of November 16th, 2022, when she clocked in for her shift. She did not know it that afternoon when she finished her route. She would not find out for several months, while the U.S. Postal Inspection Service quietly built the case around her. We're heading into the investigation now. If you want to know exactly how federal postal inspectors pulled this case apart, text by text, deposit by deposit, subscribe, and stick with me. We break down every detail. The investigation into Kristen Williams ran in parallel with the prosecution of Antonio White, and the two cases would inform each other throughout the winter of 2022 and into early 2023. Within 48 hours of White's arrest, agents from the U.S. Postal Inspection Service had executed a search warrant on his phone. The phone was unlocked through cooperation with the device manufacturer. What investigators found was the digital architecture of the entire operation. There were thousands of text messages between White and Williams. Going back to early 2022, there were photos of checks, there were photos of cash, there were dollar amount tallies, there were location pins, and there were the specific text exchanges that would become the smoking gun at Williams's federal trial. In one exchange recovered in clean form from White's phone, and later from Williams's own device after her arrest, White wrote to Williams asking her to throw that last piece and to provide him with another one. The piece was an arrow key. White said he would pay $4,000 for the next one. Williams's reply was the sentence that would do more damage at trial than any single piece of physical evidence in the case. She wrote that she had went through so much anxiety the last time she stole a key. She added that the Pritchard post office was very strict about it now. Two functions of that text. The first, it confirmed Williams knew exactly what she was doing. There was no possibility of a mistake of fact defense. She referred to the act of stealing the key as something she had done before. She referred to her own anxiety about the consequences. She acknowledged the post office's awareness of the problem. A jury would not need to infer her state of mind. She had documented it herself, in her own words, on her own phone. The second function was even more damaging. The phrase the last time indicated this was not her first arrow key sale to White. The October 2022 transaction that anchored the federal indictment was at least her second. There had been at least one prior, possibly more. That single phrase would supply the factual basis for the obstruction of justice sentencing enhancement Judge Dubose would later apply. In March of 2023, U.S. Postal Inspection Service Inspector Maxey conducted a voluntary interview with Williams at the Pritchard post office. She had not yet been formally charged. The interview was recorded. Williams admitted, on tape, that she had done illegal stuff with Antonio White. She admitted she had received money from him. She admitted she had deposited the $4,000 check from Akbar Talebi into her PNC account, knowing it was not legitimate. She told Inspector Maxey she did not know what to do. Then, in the same interview, she lied. She denied selling the arrow key. She insisted she had never removed government property from the Pritchard post office. She offered an alternative explanation for the key being in White's possession that did not survive contact with the physical evidence. Those lies, captured on tape, would become the second pillar of the obstruction enhancement at sentencing. The financial evidence came in steadily over the spring of 2023. PNC's compliance department produced Williams's account records, which showed the $4,000 Talebi deposit and a second $4,000 deposit from a separate counterfeit check that had cleared earlier in the summer of 2022. The cash withdrawal patterns matched the timing of the deposits. The amounts matched the split that Williams and White had texted about, almost down to the dollar. The U.S. Secret Service joined the investigation. The Mobile Police Department contributed its initial arrest report on White. The Bruton Police Department contributed evidence from a related investigation. The Small Business Administration's Office of Inspector General contributed financial analysis on Talebi's compromised account. The case file grew to several hundred pages. In June 2023, a federal grand jury sitting in the Southern District of Alabama returned an indictment against Kristen Ariel Williams. 5 counts. Conspiracy to commit bank fraud in violation of 18 U.S.C. paragraph 1349. 2 counts of bank fraud in violation of 18 U.S.C. paragraph 1344. Aggravated identity theft in violation of 18 U.S.C. paragraph 1028A. Theft in possession of a postal service key in violation of 18 U.S.C. paragraph 1704. The Postal Service placed her on administrative leave the day the indictment was unsealed. She was 31 years old. The confrontation that opens this video took place in the early evening of an autumn day in 2023, in the gravel lot behind the Pritchard post office, where Williams parked her personal vehicle at the end of every shift. She had finished her route. She had returned her postal vehicle. She had signed in her remaining mail and her route equipment. She had clocked out. She was walking to her Impala with her insulated lunch bag in one hand and her phone in the other, when 2 figures in plain clothes stepped out from between 2 parked cars. They were not in uniform. They did not need to be. The badges around their necks identified them as U.S. Postal Inspection Service. The lead inspector was the same Inspector Maxey who had interviewed her 7 months earlier. Another officer stood slightly behind him, one hand resting on the grip of a holstered sidearm. The conversation was short. Inspector Maxey: "Kristen, we need you to put the bag down and step away from the vehicle." Williams: "What is this about?" Inspector Maxey: "You know what this is about. You were named in a federal indictment this morning. We need you to turn around and put your hands behind your back. Williams. I don't understand. I told you everything in March. I told you I made some mistakes, but I never did the things you're saying. Inspector Maxey. Kristen, turn around. Williams. Can I call my mother? Please. Can I just call my mother? Inspector Maxey. You can call her from the office. Turn around, hands behind your back. She turned. Her shoulders dropped. Her hands came back behind her, slowly, palms open. The lunch bag hit the gravel. The phone in her other hand stayed clutched against her palm until Inspector Maxey reached down and took it from her. The cuffs went on. The Miranda warning came out of Inspector Maxey's mouth the way it had come out hundreds of times before, flat and even, the federal phrasing he could recite in his sleep. Williams did not speak again as they walked her to the unmarked vehicle on Wilson Avenue. She did not ask for a lawyer. She did not offer any further explanation. She watched the Pritchard post office, the building she had walked into for 9.5 years, recede in the side mirror as the vehicle pulled away. Her federal identification card was already in an evidence envelope on the supervisor's desk inside the building. She had clocked out of the United States Postal Service for the last time and did not yet know it. The case of United States versus Kristen Ariel Williams went to trial in the federal courthouse on St. Joseph Street in Mobile in November 2023. The prosecution was led by Assistant United States Attorney Justin Roller, working under the supervision of United States Attorney Sean P. Costello for the Southern District of Alabama. The defense argued that Williams had been used, that her relationship with Antonio White had been emotionally manipulative, that she had been a low-level participant in a scheme she did not fully understand. That theory of the case did not survive contact with the text messages. The trial ran 3 days. The government called Postal Inspection Service Inspector Maxey, who walked the jury through the arrow key inventory at the Pritchard post office, the November arrest of Antonio White, and the recovered text exchange in which Williams complained about the anxiety of stealing the previous key. The government called a PNC bank compliance officer who walked the jury through the 2 counterfeit check deposits and the matching cash withdrawals. The government called Akbar Talebi, the Theodore business owner, who testified that he had never written a $4,000 check to anyone named Kristen Williams and had not even known the name until the day federal agents knocked on his door. The government did not need to call Antonio White. He had pleaded guilty to related bank fraud and aggravated identity theft charges months earlier and was awaiting his own sentencing. The defense called Williams herself. She took the stand and testified, under oath, that she had not stolen the arrow key. She testified that she did not remember the specific texts about the post office being very strict. She testified that her March 2023 interview with Inspector Maxey had been mischaracterized. The jury did not believe her